Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends. My name is Daniel Berger, and I'm the Chief Executive of Magen Adom over here in the UK. It is my absolute pleasure to invite you and welcome you to another one in our very successful webinar series with some fabulous speakers. But before we get on, I'll introduce you to Stephen and to Dr. Wilf. Let me just take a moment to tell you about the incredible cause that I'm so proud to represent. So I'm sure many of you know Magen David Adom and think of it as Israel's national medical emergency service. If you call 101, if you need an ambulance, if you need a rapid first responder on a bike, that is Magen David Adom. It is an organization run by 2,500 now staff and amazingly over 24,000 volunteers, meaning over 90% of its workforce does this and supports the work of MDA for free, sometimes on top of their day jobs, sometimes when they're youth volunteers, instead of going to the Scouts or Girl Guide movement, they go to MDA after school and they help treat people and they learn the essential work of first aid and all about saving lives. For me, what I love most about the organization, it truly represents Israeli society. It is an organization supporting a total cross-representation of society by a cross-representation of society. And we have seen some amazing images come out over the last few months. One of them even hit the UK press, the Independent and the Daily Mail, of an Israeli Arab and an Israeli praying side by side, paramedics praying side by the ambulance. Wonderful images talking about how powerful, how apolitical, and how a-religious this cause is. It is a humanitarian cause, and it is about saving lives. The two lesser known strands of MDA are the blood services, firstly. MDA collects 97% of Israel's blood supplies. Close to 300,000 units a year are donated, stored, tested, and then distributed to hospitals around the country. That is an enormous amount. Also, 100% of the IDF's blood. This is not always known by people. And at the moment, with the corona and the race to, shall I say, to try and find a vaccine, MDA is playing a significant part here. Professor Shinar, who heads the blood services, has been busy trying to extract plasma from corona patients who have tested positive and made a full recovery and cross-match that into those coronavirus patients who are ill and giving them the plasma to see just how that comes on with the antibodies and developing the vaccine. And in terms of corona, MDA was absolutely front and center in dealing with coronavirus, the testing, the drive-through testing facilities, as we're hearing now on the corona, having whether they want to call it a second wave or not in Israel. MDA's opened more corona tests again. And just to give you a soundbite, on a typical day, MDA will receive 5,500 calls a day into its call centers. At the peak of the COVID crisis a few months back, or a few weeks back, it received over 200,000 calls, and 40-fold increase in the number of calls. And the IDF and MDA came together to make sure that Israeli society was there and ready to be protected and served by all. Thirdly, and finally, the part that I am really passionate about and I love, MDA is the Red Cross Society, and it has been since 2005 of Israel. It's the national society. Magen David Adom quite literally stands for Red Shield of David. And along with the Palestinian Red Crescent, it was admitted as a full member of the Red Cross back in 2005. This means that it represents Israel on the world stage. It is a flag-flying, amazing ambassador for everything that is brilliant out of Israel. MDA has operated around the world in humanitarian disasters. It's, for example, been in Houston. It was running a field clinic in Haiti. There's a wonderful photo of an MDA paramedic side by side in Haiti with a member of the Canadian Red Cross, the Norwegian Red Cross, and the Iranian Red Crescent. Amazing images, powerful images to see, just again how humanitarian life-saving work transcends politics. And that, to me, is what makes it a remarkable and unique organization. It also works domestically. It's helped the Syrian refugees with the IDF come in, taking them to the Sfat hospital the Ziv hospital in Sfat, I should say, apologies. So it really does so much about saving lives. So that, in a nutshell, is Magen Adom. I want to thank you personally if you're already a supporter. If you aren't yet and you want to be a supporter, please go to our website, go to our Facebook page, call us, contact us, and we would be honoured and thrilled to have you as a supporter of MDA here in the UK. It's now my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Stephen Jaffe. Stephen is a fundraising consultant for Magen Adom, and Stephen is extremely well known in the UK communities. He's a great friend of many of the Friends of Israel groups, and he's known everywhere. And Stephen is responsible for bringing some of the amazing speakers, such as tonight's guest speaker, to you. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to my friend Stephen, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's a huge honor to introduce Dr. Einat Wilf, our speaker this evening. She is one of Israel's finest political and strategic commentators, observers. Whether you agree or disagree with Dr. Einat Wilf, no one doubts the cogency and passion of her contributions to essential questions that Israel faces regarding Zionism, Israel's economy, its education, relations with the Jewish diaspora, foreign affairs. Einat holds a doctorate from the University of Cambridge in political science. She is a former member of the Knesset for the Israeli Labour Party and the Independence Party under the leadership of Ehud Barak. She's a frequent broadcaster in Israel, a contributor to radio and TV programs, newspaper columnist, and the author of a number of very significant books. Her latest book is The War of Return: How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream has Obstructed the Path to Peace. And that's what Einat is going to speak about this evening. It's a book that's co-authored with Adi Schwartz. It's a runaway bestseller already in Israel. Now that it's been translated into English, I'm sure it's going to provoke a lot of debate in the English-speaking world as well and beyond. It's available on Amazon UK. Einat, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you so much to MDA for having me here. I'm a big fan of the work that MDA MADA does in Israel, and especially I want to thank you all for your ongoing support. So I want to share with you a little bit why I even decided to write the book, The War of Return, together with my co-writer, Adi Schwartz. By now, I think I can safely say that I've devoted about a decade to speaking and thinking and researching and writing about the issue of the Palestinian refugees and the role of this issue in the conflict. And one might think, why? It doesn't seem to be a kind of main issue. And I want to share with you how I discovered that it was the issue and therefore deserving of quite a bit of investment. So I grew up in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Beit HaKerem. And when I grew up, I was surrounded by labor people and part of left-wing Israeli politics. And as a young adult in the 80s and 90s, I very much identified with the key issue of the Labour Party politics at the time, which was the idea that Israel has a path to peace, and the path to peace is based on a very simple, almost elegant equation that was called land for peace. Basically, all that Israel has to do in order to have peace was hand over land, which it acquired as a result of the 1967 Six-Day War, and in return for that land, Israel should finally expect peace with its Arab neighbors, the peace that eluded it when it was just born and declared independence. Now, I was one of the kids that they took out of the schools, the elementary schools in Jerusalem, to wave flags to the motorcade of Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, who came to speak of peace in the Knesset. And indeed, the peace agreement we signed with Egypt within 2 years was based on the land for peace formula. Israel handed over the entire Sinai Peninsula with all its valuable oil, twice the size of Israel, and basically got a peace agreement with Egypt. We can have an interesting discussion as to whether we have peace with Egypt, but we signed a peace agreement. Now, the 1990s were really the culmination of the Land for Peace formula. Throughout that decade, which was really this decade of euphoria, not just in Israel, I mean, globally, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe becoming free, and the Good Friday Agreement and end of apartheid, there was really this kind of global euphoria of taking care of business, of putting old conflicts behind. And throughout the 90s, we were negotiating based on this Land for Peace formula. We were negotiating with Syria over the Golan Heights. We signed a peace agreement with Jordan once Jordan gave up its territorial claim to the West Bank. And of course, the highlight was the negotiations with the Oslo Accords, directly with the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians. And really, the feeling was that peace is around the corner. Israel is willing to hand over land. Israel is going to get peace. And this culminates in the year 2000. In the year 2000, Ehud Barak, the leader of the Israeli peace camp of the Labor Party, goes to Camp David, which is symbolic. This is where peace was negotiated with with Egypt. He goes to Camp David and he puts on the table, he checks all the boxes of what was supposed to get us peace with the Palestinians. A fully independent and sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, controlling its borders, everything. No settlements. Settlements were either going to be dismantled or replaced with similar land. So all of the West Bank and Gaza, no settlements. So that would mean an end to the occupation, no settlements. So those two issues were not going to be a thing. And East Jerusalem was going to be the capital of Palestine, including parts of the Old City. So holy sites within the Old City were also included. Check, check, check all the boxes. What does Yasser Arafat do? Walk away. All he had to say was yes, and the Palestinians would have had an independent state, an end to the occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, and Arafat walks away. He walks away from President Clinton, who reformulates the Barak proposal into parameters. And 8 years later, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, walks away from a similar proposal by Ehud Olmert, who leads the Israeli peace camp at that moment. And not only do they walk away from clear, concrete opportunities on the table to have an independent state in the West Bank and Gaza, and to the occupation, no settlement, capital in East Jerusalem, what follows is bloody mayhem and violence, especially in 2001, 2, 3, 4. It's massacre in our streets. People are being blown to bits for going to pizzerias, to cafes in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Netanya, for boarding a bus. And this is literally weeks and days after the Palestinians could have had their own state. And a lot of Israelis, like myself, begin to ask, then what do they want? If they don't take the opportunity to have a state, then what do they want? And at this point, Adi Schwartz, who was a senior editor at Haaretz, a very left-wing newspaper, I, working in the Labour Party, not yet of Knesset, but I was already working with Yossi Beilin, the architect of the Accords, with Shimon Peres. We begin to research into this issue and to meet with Palestinians because we go back to the drawing table. We want to know, what do the Palestinians want if it's not a state? And what we realize is that the answer was hiding in plain sight. They were telling us all along, we just didn't listen. Or when we did listen, we didn't take it seriously. What they wanted was this thing that they called a right of return. Now, in the book, we make it clear that it's neither a right nor a return. But just to be clear what the Palestinians mean by it, what the Palestinians mean while claiming that no thing is more important than the right of return, they are saying that in their mind, millions of Palestinians, the lowest number is 5.5, the higher number is 8 or 9, but millions of Palestinians possess a right, they believe it's a right, that breaches Israeli sovereignty to settle inside Israel in its pre-1967 lines. And the numbers are such, of course, that it would transform Israel by this mechanism of settling inside Israel into a Palestinian Arab state with a Jewish minority. This means that all throughout the decades of negotiations, when Palestinians declared their willingness for a two-state solution, which some of them still do, the only two states they had in mind was an Arab-Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Arab-Palestinian state to replace Israel. To date, there has not been a single Palestinian leader, not even a minor leader, not even an op-ed writer for that matter, who envisioned a peace where the state of Israel at the end of the process remains as is, as the sovereign state of the Jewish people. It means that from their perspective, they have never, and for a single moment, ever given up on their vision, which they say at every demonstration, from the river, the Jordan River, to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, an Arab Palestine will be free. I sometimes add in parentheses of Jews. That's the vision, and there never has been another vision. And what our book does is basically trace the development of that vision from 1948. Before that, there were no refugees. Refugees are only the outcome of the war which the Arab sides wages and which was not necessary, the war against partition and against the establishment of the state of Israel, and how this idea that Palestinians remain refugees decade after decade, generation after generation, unlike all other refugees in the world. No other group of refugees from the 1940s are refugees today with their descendants claiming to be refugees. It doesn't exist. So we trace how this was allowed to exist, how this grew, what were the implications of that for the conflict, for the ability to make peace, how the West, including the UK, of course, became between complicit and indulgent in perpetuating this issue, and how in order to get to peace, we must deal with this issue long before we deal with any other thing. So this is the core of the conflict, this and nothing else. And the Palestinians again and again have made the choice to forgo having an independent state in part of the land from the river to the sea, if the price of having their own independent state, ending the occupation, no settlements, if the price would have meant that there would be no mass return into the state of Israel, at least to date, they deemed it too high a price to pay. So let me stop here, and I'll be more than happy to take your questions.
Fascinating. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. That was absolutely enlightening, and I appreciate it. It's very difficult to say so much in such a short period of time. Just wanting to see what questions we've got. I believe I'm just going to jump to chat. We have one from Judy, thanking you for your enlightening talk and asking if you could talk a little bit further about the fact that Turkey has got very involved with the Palestinian residents in East Jerusalem.
I'm sorry, I missed what was the second half of the question?
Could you talk about the fact that Turkey has got involved with the Palestinian residents in East Jerusalem, how they've got involved?
I am sorry, this is less of something that I'm specialized in. I mean, in recent decades, there's always been foreign involvement with the Palestinians, whether in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and even, unfortunately, within the state of Israel. But I'm sorry that I'm not able to say much more than that.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate some of these are slightly left of field. Any other questions on here? How long have had you been planning the book? I mean, when did you start thinking about writing this book?
So I've started dealing with this issue about a decade ago when I was a member of parliament, a member of Knesset, and I was a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. And I raised this issue because as I became increasingly aware of how important this issue is to the Palestinians, I was also aware of how little this issue is known. I mean, generally, when people discuss the conflict, when they will discuss the obstacles to peace, they will talk about Israeli settlements, or the assumption will be that somehow Israel is preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state. And the assumption will be that the Palestinians have already made their peace with the fact that the land, the strip of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea will be divided between an Arab state and a Jewish state as envisioned by the United Nations. I mean, this was the assumptions of all the peacemakers, whether within Israel or globally, that the fundamental issue of the conflict, the one that was responsible for the wars throughout the 30s and certainly the major war of 1948, the fact that the Arab world rejected the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, the assumption was that this was settled, that the Palestinians knew that Israel is here to stay, and now we just need to discuss how Israel hands over the land and gets rid of the settlements and security arrangements. I mean, this is what everyone talks about. So when I became aware that we are having an entirely different conversation from the Palestinians. When you talk to Palestinians, there's no doubt. One of the first reviews that came for our book was a very angry review from a Palestinian. And one of the amazing things, the reason that he was so angry, was that he was angry that we described in the book the refugee issue as hiding in plain sight or flying under the radar. Because if I would summarize his entire review, it was basically something like, what did you think that we wanted? I mean, there is not a single Palestinian, and you're more than welcome to check it yourself, who ever basically undermines the thesis of the book. At most, they will dig deeper. But there is no one who will come out and say, what are you talking about? Of course, we gave up the right of return a long time ago. We understand it's not serious. It's merely a bargaining chip. No, on the contrary, they will dig deeper and say, what do you mean? This is our right. This is our justice. Why should we give it up? They will use those terms, but they will never claim that it's not important or that it's less important than having a state. So the Palestinians confirmed this thesis. And I remember bringing to the Knesset and the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, how is it that Israel doesn't put it front and center? Because there is no clearer way to expose the core of the conflict than to ask Palestinians straight on, what is your view on the right of return? And they will always respond, it's our right, it's sacred, it's holy, why should we give it up? And of course, people who are not knowledgeable on this issue will think it's normal, except that there is no such right, and all other refugees gave it up because it was never theirs to begin with. Refugees throughout the 20th century did not return. They moved on to create new lives in the places to which they fled or other places. But they did not go back because after partition, after the drawing of borders, they did not go back because that meant the reopening of war. So my question was, why are we not putting it front and center? And there's all kinds of reasons in Israel, and sometimes we're our own worst enemies. But it really led me to speaking and researching the issue much more. And through this, I met Adi, and Adi had the idea to write a book. And I basically told him that I want to be his co-author. And we've been working on the book now for about 5 years. About 2 years ago, it came out in Israel. For the last 2 years, we've been working on the English language version. And if I may, I think this is the book to read about the conflict, because one of the things that the book does, I think, very well is it finally gives Palestinians the respect of taking them at their word. Rather than kind of explaining away that they don't really mean it and it's a delusion, we take them at their word, we take them seriously, we actually show how serious they are, that they are so serious about it that they are repeatedly willing to forgo having a sovereign state, which is not a normal thing for people to do if what they really want is the end of the occupation or having a state. The reason that they repeatedly forgo it is because there is something that they value much more. And the thing that they value much more is this idea of return. And the reason that they value it much more is not some emotional attachment to houses. Every refugee in history had this emotional attachment, and yet they moved on. What keeps this alive for them is that for them, by now, this is the main mechanism by which they still hope to undo the state of Israel. They fail to do it by violence, and they fail to do it by terrorism, and they fail to do it by economic boycotts. And return by now has remained pretty much the only means by which they think that one day they will undo this temporary Zionist aberration in the region.
Thank you. Well, it's definitely a book that I'm going to pick up and be reading. We're getting a lot of questions in about the annexation, and there's one good question here. What is your view with the peace plan? Do you think President Trump will be able to deliver peace in the region, for one?
Okay. So a bit on the path to peace, because the book is still very much about how to make peace. But it basically says, look, land for peace was never going to work with the Palestinians because they were indulged in their worldview that all of the land from the river to the sea is uniquely theirs, and that even though they repeatedly lost in wars, they will one day regain it. So the only way to ever get to peace with the Palestinians is only if they transform their worldview to looking at the Jewish people as equal and legitimate claimants to the land. And we're not there yet. Only when that happens can we actually have a normal discussion over borders. So one of the things we discuss in the book is how to get to peace by reformatting or undoing the Palestinian view that sovereignty for the Jewish people in any part of the land is illegitimate and therefore needs to be undone. And of course, one of the main paths we recommend is dismantling UNRWA, making it clear to Palestinians that they're not refugees, that the war of 1948 is long over, and that they need to move on and build their future where they are, rather than keep themselves in limbo, hoping for a future from the river to the sea. Now, in this context, there were numerous peace plans that all failed because they dealt with land, how to deal with borders, settlements, what to do. But at no point were the Palestinians simply ready to discuss land, and we show why, therefore, in 2000 and 2008, they walk away from excellent opportunities to have a state in part of the land, because that's not what they want. Now, Israelis have now spent nearly 3 decades negotiating with Palestinians over this assumption of land for peace, that the Palestinians have made a historic break with their animosity towards Jewish self-determination and are ready to discuss the details of partition, of how to divide the land. Oslo was in this context, the Barak proposal was in this context, and Olmert, everything was in this context. And they all failed spectacularly because they didn't deal with the key issues. So the vast majority of Israelis have come to the conclusion that there is no one with whom to negotiate on the Palestinian side over questions of borders and settlements and land. This is the famous no partner for peace. And in that sense, there is almost no Israeli political representation today for people who think that the reason we don't have peace is because Israel didn't try enough, or that Israel didn't offer enough. I mean, that worldview basically collapsed with reality, was mugged by reality. Present, I'm a case in point, and it has no more political representation. I mean, barely 2-3 seats at most. So Israelis decided unilateral disengagement from Gaza. Let them turn Gaza. We'll just leave without an agreement. Let them turn Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East. Gaza becomes a Hamas-ruled base for rockets. So Israelis say, okay, we can't get out of the West Bank and Gaza through a peace agreement. We can't unilaterally disengage without handing over the land to a rocket base. So what are we going to do? And from that moment on, Israelis basically adopt the worldview that we're stuck, what Mika Goodman called catch 67. We can't leave safely, but we don't really want to stay. We don't want to rule over the Palestinians. So what are we going to do? So now the vast Israeli population, the Jewish Israelis, are basically have a consensus around 3 main issues. First, west of the Jordan River, there will be only one military, the Israel Defense Forces. 2, the Palestinians should rule themselves. Whether you call it a state minus, an autonomy plus, we don't want to rule over them. And third, we will not take out settlements unless we know that it's worth it, which means full and complete peace, because it's too much of a political and national hassle. So we want to know that if we take down settlements and go through that political effort, it's worth it. This is the consensus. The Trump plan, the American Vision for Peace, as it's called, basically deals with these 3 issues. It's about Palestinian self-rule on the way to a state. It's a state minus in the sense that it's demilitarized. So the Israel Defense Forces is the only military west of the Jordan River. And the map is built so that Israel doesn't need to take out settlements. The settlements become kind of enclaves or exclaves inside a Palestinian state, which many of the settlers don't like, but most Israelis don't mind. In that sense, most Israelis support the plan. They don't think it will bring peace in the sense that Palestinians, as they said to this plan, 1,000 times no. But there are no Israelis right now who think that a more generous plan, such as the Barak or the Olmert proposal, would yield a yes. At the moment, short of Israel's suicide, there is no plan that would yield a Palestinian yes. So the American plan is good enough in terms of where the Israeli consensus is, and it's especially attractive if it serves as a basis for greater normalization with Arab countries. That might be its greatest kind of point of attraction. In terms of the annexation part of it, most Israelis, and in that sense, I think I speak for the 70% of Israelis who have made it repeatedly clear in polls that they could care less about the issue. They don't understand why they're bothered with it. They don't understand why it's necessary. We have bigger fish to fry right now. We have more important priorities with the pandemic, with the economy. Except for a few die-hard settlers, and even the settlers are divided among themselves. Some of them fear that saying yes to a Palestinian state, which is the American price of annexation, is not worth it. Some of them say no, it's worth it. But those are pretty much the only people who care about this issue. So right now, it's about a non-issue in Israel, and somehow a lot of people talk about it outside of Israel, but I can't convey to you the extent to which Israelis don't care about it.
Yeah. And in your opinion, do you think that age-old question, is peace ever going to be achievable? Will everyone ever come to the table and agree on everything, or even half of the things?
So often when I speak to this issue and I go through really what the conflict is about and how deeply entrenched is the Arab and Palestinian worldview that the Jews as a people, I mean, they are not willing to even recognize the Jews as a people and a nation, merely as followers of a faith who can be a minority in an Arab country. But the extent to which they refuse to acknowledge that the Jews are a people, that they have a historical connection to the land, and are therefore deserving of the universal right to self-determination in it. I mean, it is so deep. This is so much at the core of the conflict. A lot of people basically see it as the sign of, so when are we going to have peace if this is so deeply entrenched? And my answer is typically not tomorrow and before never. Any time in between is a good assessment. So the one thing I will say, it's not never. Human societies have been known to transform. Collectives have been known to reinterpret their foundational ideas. Sometimes people tell me it's about Islam, it's about the Arab worldview with respect to Jews. Sure. But religion is malleable. Religion is open to interpretation. We've seen all religions, all nations, all systems of values reinterpreted. What has been made by humans can be remade and reinterpreted by humans. So I do believe that if we deal with the issue directly, if the Palestinians finally receive a message, both from the Arab world and from the Western world, the same message, by the way, that all refugees in the 20th century got. I'm not asking them to be treated more harshly, just equally. The message was, move on. The war is over. Wherever you are now is wherever you're going to be. Move on with your life. Build a future. You can build a future in your state, just so you get a sense of how absurd the whole refugee situation is. The refugee situation is the biggest issue in the mindset of Palestinians, but it's actually the smallest issue on the ground, because 40% of those who claim to be refugees live in the West Bank and Gaza. So that's where they're going to stay. So they're not refugees. Another 40% are naturalized citizens of Jordan and have been since 1950. So they're citizens. Nowhere in the world are citizens of a functioning country considered refugees from a third country in which they've never been. So they're not refugees. The remaining ones in Lebanon and Syria have long gone. So the actual number of real refugees is probably 20, 30,000, maybe including their descendants, 200,000. That's it. That's a number that can be easily integrated and resettled. So that issue can be taken care of. The Palestinians, once they begin to be treated like all other refugees, when the message is the war of 1948 is over, Israel is here to stay, you're not refugees, there's no right of return, you're not going into Israel, you're not going to settle inside Israel, all of this is over. Once they hear that message clearly, they can begin the long process of reformatting their identity to finally, even if reluctantly, come to terms with the permanence of the state of Israel as the sovereign state of the Jewish people. In the book, as a hopeful story, we bring the story of the German refugees after World War II, who were brutally expelled and wanted to return to their lands in what became Poland, but was Germany, and the Sudeten, what was Czechoslovakia. Did anyone indulge them? Did they get an organization with the letter UN in it that sustained them for decades, generation after generation, in the worldview that they're still refugees? No. And it took 24 years for a German chancellor, Willy Brandt, to emerge, to sign an agreement with Poland, to acknowledge the final borders, and give a speech. In the book, we say there should be a cut and paste of the speech to a Palestinian leader, and then we know there's peace. A speech in which he basically tells the German refugees and their descendants, it's over, the lands are lost, there's going to be return, and we need to look to the future. And this is not about surrendering, it's about employing common sense. That's the kind of speech that we need to hear from a Palestinian leader. Now, I don't know if it's going to take 24 years like in Germany, more or less, but I know for certain that it's not going to happen as long as the world, and especially the West, continues its decades-long indulgence of the Palestinian worldview that the War of 48 is still an open file, that they are refugees, and that they possess somehow a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel.
And tell me, on this subject, the UN and UNRWA or UNRWA, what's their views and contribution to this?
Disastrous. UNRWA begins as a benign organization. It's established after the war in 1950 with the purpose to integrate the Arab refugees to the local country. So it's clear. They're the same ethnicity, the same language, almost all of them the same religion, the same geography. In all other refugee situations in the world where this was the case, Germans into Germany, Koreans into South Korea, that's it. They were integrated and they moved on. The Palestinians, the Arab refugees themselves, later to be called, renamed the Palestinians, the Arab refugees themselves reject local integration. They even assassinate the Jordanian King Abdallah because he wants to integrate them, and he naturalized them and makes them citizens. They reject, and we have a lot of moving stories in the book that show really how the Arab refugees themselves, they're not pawns. They are agents of history. They themselves reject local integration. The Arab countries too reject local integration. And the message from both the refugees and the Arab countries is, look, we might have temporarily lost the war of 1948, but the big war against Zionism, against Israel, continues. And therefore, the refugees should not be integrated and resettled because they're going to go back fairly soon once we re-win this war. Now, the US and the UK, who initially are willing to give a lot of money and effort for UNRWA for the purpose of settling the refugees, just as an example, there's another organization, UNRWA, established at the same time for the Korean refugees from the Korean War. It settles 2 million refugees in 4 years with less money than was allocated for UNRWA. And look at where South Korea is today. It could have been the Palestinians. But UNRWA, no. The Arabs reject moving on. And basically the British and the American want out. They want to close down UNRWA. Already in the mid-1950s, they know that UNRWA is a useless organization that will not settle one Arab refugee because no one's willing to cooperate with it. So they want to close down UNRWA. And the Arab world, using the Cold War, using the importance of oil, using its relative unity at the time in the Arab League, essentially threatened the UK and the US into keeping UNRWA open. And UNRWA, from that moment on, from the end of the 50s to the present, becomes a racket, becomes essentially an annual bribe operation whereby the West bribes the Arab world into not being too angry that it actually supported the establishment of the State of Israel in the UN General Assembly, the partition vote. The Soviet Union is gone. The Cold War is over. Oil is not what it used to be. The Arab world is no longer united, not even united in its opposition to Israel. So Adi and I believe that the time is more than ripe for the West to dismantle UNRWA, to end this annual bribe operation. The schooling, the healthcare, all of that could be handed over to the local authorities. Now, the important thing to mention, and I think this is a very powerful part of our book, when the UK and the US decide to cave in and to annually bribe the Arab world by donating to UNRWA, they think that if it's not going to be useful, it's not going to cause any harm. They know that UNRWA is useless. They just say it's going to be harmless. What we show is that it's the exact opposite. UNRWA becomes the breeding ground for a new Palestinian national identity in the UNRWA refugee camps, in the UNRWA schools. Now, that in itself is not a problem. New national identities were created throughout the 20th century. That in itself is not a problem. The problem is that the kind of Palestinian national identity that is forged in the UNRWA refugee camps and the UNRWA schools is one that is uniquely focused on revenge and return. And we tell in the book the story of how the perpetrators of the Munich massacre of the Israeli athletes to the Munich Olympics are children of the refugee camps. I mean, if you're going to massacre athletes and mutilate them in an Olympics, you have to really believe that you're doing it for a good cause. And indeed, the survivors are very proud of what they did, the Palestinian perpetrators. They think it was a great operation. And they grew up in the Palestinian refugee camps. We have a quote from a senior member of Fatah about the 60s and 70s. And he says, "We are able to train one person at a time, but UNRWA prepares the minds and hearts of thousands." That's what UNRWA did. UNRWA created a Palestinian national identity uniquely focused on revenge and return, which is why it has to be dismantled. It can't be reformed. Only when it's dismantled can the process of reformatting the Palestinian identity away from revenge and return and towards building their own independent state in part of the land, can we move closer to peace.
A couple more questions coming out, particularly vis-a-vis the PR in the Hasbara, how Israel can better position its messaging here, and is there a good elevator pitch that we can talk to people here, or some people can share with others, with students in universities, and explain this succinctly and easily? Probably a hard question to ask.
It's actually become very easy ever since I've been working on this issue. I've been speaking to delegations for years now. In the beginning, I used to define my success if they would leave Israel thinking it's complicated. I thought this is good. If they think it's complicated, next time they hear something, they will withhold judgment, knowing that it's complicated. But the more I've delved into the UNRWA issue, the refugees, this so-called right of return, I realized that it's actually very simple. The entire conflict is and has always been about the Arab rejection of the Jewish rights to self-determination in any part of the land. That's it. That's always been the conflict. That was the conflict when they tried to prevent our immigration in the 20s and 30s. That was the conflict when they rejected partition, right? They could have celebrated 72 years in an Arab land, which would have been on half of the territory. No. That was the reason they rejected all proposals for peace with Israel, for having a Palestinian state on only part of the land. They actually are remarkably consistent. To their credit, they're very consistent. They've been saying the same thing all along. It's only us who were desperate to believe that something has changed. So all you have here is a really simple conflict between one side that wants all of it and another side that is willing to repeatedly compromise. That's conflict. I can, and this is how I've explained it to my 7-year-old boy. Kids really understand a conflict between someone who wants everything and repeatedly says all or nothing, and someone who says, you know what, I would like to have everything, but I'll settle for something. That's it. That's the conflict. Really simple. We can then discuss why the Palestinians think they can have everything and why the Jews are repeatedly willing to settle for something. I think we cannot afford to be an all or nothing people. The option of nothing is just too harrowing. Sometimes when I speak to Western diplomats and journalists and, I detail this whole issue, they often respond by saying, the Palestinians know that they're not returning. It's a delusion. Now, in addition to the fact that I think it's this very neo-colonial attitude that basically says, sure, they're saying something, but they don't mean it, when all the evidence is that they actually mean it, I say, look at the map. The Palestinians look at the map every day, and what do they see? They see 7 million Jews trying to maintain sovereignty amidst half a billion Arabs, nearly 1.5 billion Muslims. From their perspective, they rationally conclude that this Zionist experiment is not going to last much more than the Crusaders. That's their view of history, that we are merely a temporary aberration in the
I believe we've lost Dr. Wilf. I've got a couple more questions on the chat that we'll ask through. If anyone's got anything else, if they can put it up there now, because the aim is to try and close this off in about 8 minutes' time. Are you back, Einat?
I'm back.
Hi.
When is the part that I was cut off?
I lost you when you were talking about...
when I said I think we're a temporary aberration.
Yes, I heard the Crusaders and
what?
temporary
I'm sorry?
aberration. Yes, okay. Crusaders and temporary aberration.
Temporary aberration. So from their perspective, it's an entirely rational worldview. Them being the dominant force in the region, right? Since the 7th century Arab and Islamic conquests of North Africa and the Middle East, this is an Arab and Islamic region, and they've been very successful. One must hand it to them. So in their view, from that moment on, the Crusaders are a temporary aberration, and Israel is a temporary aberration, and it's a rational worldview. So they, in their view, they can play for time. They can wait another generation, another 5 generations. Ultimately, it will revert to being an Arab land, and the Jews will revert to being the only proper role for Jews in the Arab and Islamic world as followers of a faith who know their subservient place. So this is the conflict. It's really simple. And I agree with you. The fact that we cannot explain something so simple is deeply frustrating. We are willing to make so many excuses. And in science, there's an idea that basically says if you have several explanations for phenomena, you always choose the simplest one. That's my argument. This is the simplest explanation. It explains the Arab and Palestinian behavior throughout, very consistent. Why not just go for this simple explanation? And I agree with you. I share your frustration. I do hope that at least the book will.
I think there must be. Are you back? Yeah, I hope we got up to. I do hope that the book.
Yeah, I do hope that the book will contribute to bringing that simple idea back. that the conflict is and has always been about the Arab rejection of the right of the Jewish people to sovereignty in any part of the land, in any borders. That's it. That's the conflict.
No, very much so. I think with your Wi-Fi dropping and you're on the subject of the book, do you just want to mention your book again, give people the details of that? I can see it's on Amazon, so just tell us briefly about the book again.
Sure.
Remind people.
So this is the book.
There you go.
It's called The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. If I may, it's a very well-researched book. We were warned by our publisher that there will be an effort to tear us apart at the level of footnotes. So it's a very well-researched book, and I can share that no one has been able to tear us apart on the factual level. And it also got great reviews for being very readable. So I think this is, in my view, the one book that actually tells the story of the conflict as it is, and also shows the path to peace, even if it's a long path. The idea of peace now, the idea of land for peace, we have to forgo that any notion that they are simple, elegant formulas for peace. This is a long road that requires nothing less than the reformatting of Palestinian identity. Now, to those who think this might seem a bit harsh, I may say that this is exactly what Palestinians demand of us. They demand, and have always demanded, the reformatting of Jewish identity away from Zionism. They say we can have peace once Jews stop being Zionists and are content to live as a religious minority in our midst. That also is the whole one state idea. It's the whole same notion. And this is the one place where you cannot split the difference. You can divide land, you can take down settlements, you can make security arrangements. All other issues can be negotiated and you can split the difference. The one place where you cannot split the difference is how each side thinks about the conflict. So either the Jews give up on their idea that they deserve the right to self-determination and are content to go back and live as a minority among others. This is the Arab path to peace. Or the Palestinians understand that the Jewish people are equally deserving as a people and a nation of the right to self-determination in the land to which they have a historical connection, and that they are here to stay. This is the one element of the conflict where you cannot split the difference. It has to be determined one way or another. Of course, I very much want it to be determined in a way that lets the Jewish people have their state, have the self-determination. As a Zionist, I do not want to go back to the time when we were helpless and defenseless and did not have a state and were merely a minority among others, where the others would decide whether we live or die, mostly die. I don't want that. So yes, I want to get to peace, where ultimately the Palestinians understand that the Jewish people are equally deserving of the right to self-determination in the land and are willing to negotiate and make peace based on this assumption. To discuss the details of the land, settlements, security, that's fine. But the one thing where I cannot negotiate away is the Jewish right to self-determination.
Yeah, we could talk for hours on this. It's a very, very hot topic and a fascinating topic. Lots of questions still flying in. One more, if I may. You talked before about the ability to perhaps reinterpret religion, and you were touching on an example of the 76 Munich massacre and the beliefs from some of the people in one of the Palestinian camps. Do you believe that it's possible for the Muslims to reinterpret the Quran in a more positive way?
Absolutely. The Christians did it both with respect to Jews and Zionism. I see no reason that Muslims can do it. Islam, very much like Judaism, is a religion of interpretation. And you're actually seeing it right now. You don't have to believe me. Because of various events in the last decade, most notably the so-called Arab Spring, rise of Iran, you're seeing Gulf states and Saudi eager to be closer with Israel. Now, they're not, they cannot just go to their people and say, look, Israel is still a terrible country, but because of Iran, we're going to play nice with Israel. People don't, people don't like interests. They want stories. So what you're seeing now in the Gulf and in Saudi is a concerted effort, which is clearly coming from above, knowing those countries, to portray Israel, Zionism, and the Jews in a far more positive light in the name of Islam. That's the fascinating thing. And when Saudis speak in the name of Islam, it actually carries weight. So what you're hearing is increasingly phrases that say things like, why do we have a problem with Jews? Islam accepts all three scriptures. Of course they have a history in the land. So moving away from decades of Arab denial of the connection between the Jewish people and the land. So it's interesting because it's phrased in Islamic terms. And I think this is the most interesting change we're seeing. And this is what's going to make it durable. Over time, I do believe that the Arab and Islamic world has all the tools in its scriptures and its history to reformulate its attitude towards Israel in a way that works well with Islam. I've actually consulted that on Islamic scholars, and they all say, look, in terms of the texts, there's nothing to prevent the reinterpretation of the texts in a way that welcomes the establishment of Israel. So just like we've had Christians who reformulated their thinking to welcome Zionism, I actually do believe that it is possible. And amazingly, we're seeing it happen now. It's not just a fanciful idea anymore. Oh, and maybe I'll add one more thing. Please. What those countries are saying to Palestinians now, no Westerner would dare say, because they know the scam they've been running for several decades. They say it openly. They tell Palestinians on television and op-eds, enough, we're done, we're through, move on, we're no longer going to sustain you. Enough with all these decades of rejection. When are you going to say yes to something? And they say it with a kind of certainty that Westerners don't even dare say. So there's a lot of positive developments in that direction.
Thank you. I've been going through the comments, and I think, Einat, you've answered virtually everything. Desperately have a sip of water. Before we conclude, I just thought I'd bring it back, having reflected on what you've said, all of which is absolutely fascinating. But I thought, if you'll permit me for a moment, just to share a couple of anecdotal points that I think are key to what drives me and what drives Magen David Adom as part of the Red Cross. So firstly, I just wanted to share with this audience and with yourself, the communities here in the UK, and I know one of our donors who helped fund the first Israeli Arabs MDA station in Sachin is on with us tonight. And, again, it's with immense pride that here we are in the UK, both the Jewish and Christian communities, helping build peace, helping ensure that there is equality for all citizens within Israel. And it's, as I say, it's something that I'm immensely proud about. And we go, and when I visit these stations and see 3 generations of Israeli Arab family working side by side, it's a remarkable thing to see. And we sit down and we quite literally talk, put the world to right, and break bread and hummus and baklava and great coffee in Sachin. So it is a wonderful thing that we're doing. And my chairman and I have been on an absolute mission lately. We've been engaging with a gentleman called Dr. Mohammed Al-Hadid in Amman, in Jordan. Dr. Al-Hadid isn't known to many people for what he did. He's currently president of the Jordanian Red Crescent. He was chairman of the Standing Commission of the entire Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. And he personally fought for a number of years for MDA's inclusion into the Red Cross movement by adopting the Red Crystal as a third protocol. And I think it's absolutely testament to the positive things that can come out of the Middle East as well, from neighbors that aren't always seen as friends, even with peace agreements. And we're passionate about working side by side with the Jordan Red Crescent. And I know that MDA does a lot of joint training, simulation exercises, and they have a great relationship. And in fact, there was a Ben Gurion University course where it had both Jordanian Red Crescent and MDA paramedics training side by side with EU funding. So I just wanted to put it out there that there is good news in the Middle East too. And MDA has definitely seen some benefit to working with some of its neighbors. And again, that's what makes me so proud to represent this organization. And it's been an amazing evening. I wanted to thank you personally. It's late in Israel, and for giving up your time to talk about your book. I, for one, will definitely be reading it and look forward to downloading it getting it from Amazon. I presume I can get it on the Kindle too. And I wanted to thank you because it really has been an enlightening evening and a wonderful end to the weekend. So thank you very much. Stay safe. I hope we can get out to Israel soon. I hope you can get the spikes sorted and you'll start welcoming as a country foreign visitors once more. And ladies and gentlemen on this call, friends, thank you very much. Thank you for your support. And again, my shameless plug, if you want to support further, please do buy Einat's book, support Magen Adom, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening. So good evening and good night, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you.